Welcome to Anonymous Stories. If you've ever wondered what really happens behind closed doors, you're in the right place. Here, we dive into the most shocking, jaw-dropping, and scandalous infidelity stories, real confessions from people who've lived through betrayal, heartbreak, and revenge. New stories drop every week, so don't miss out. Hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay updated. Let's get to 1,000 subscribers before the end of the month. I know we can do it.
I believed my father was safeguarding me. For years, I thought he was the protector. Dads are expected to be like that, a shield, a mentor, someone who loves you unconditionally. At least, that's what I convinced myself each time I looked at him. Nevertheless, the reality was that he would consistently be there for me, shielding me from the worst that life could bring. My mother was my foundation. She was a type of woman whose presence illuminated every space she entered. Her absence felt like a void that consumed everything I believed I knew. Just when I thought life couldn't shatter me any further, my dad found a way to ensure it did. The truth turned out to be darker than I had ever envisioned. Over time, the person I trusted most transformed into the one I dreaded facing every morning. The change happened slowly, with each dawn bringing an increasing tide of uncontrollable emotions. I wish I could say I noticed it. This is my story, a narrative of betrayal, a narrative of resilience, and a narrative of finding my voice despite all attempts to silence it. My name is Valerie Warner. While growing up, my life seemed like it could belong to anyone. It was a blend of small joys, routine days, and a kind of comfort you only recognize once it's lost. My mom, Claire, was the heart of our family. She was the person who remembered every tiny detail about you that made you smile. She was the individual who recalled everything that caused your laughter, even while you cried. As far back as I can remember, Mom was my sanctuary. My dad, Jackson, and Abbott were calm, not cold, and she had a laugh that could brighten even the darkest times. It was the joy derived from breakfast on your toughest days. Things weren't perfect, no family is, but I always felt lucky to have Sunday movie nights when we'd pile onto the couch and lose track of time. Mom would regularly whip up popcorn that was slightly burnt, yet still delightful, and Dad would sit beside her, his arm casually resting over her shoulders. It represented the essence of normalcy, yet in hindsight I recognized its vulnerability. My mom's illness, unlike the abrupt ailments you often witness on television, was a prolonged, cruel journey. Watching her fade over months felt like standing on the brink of a cliff, knowing there was no way to pull her back. I was merely 16, but in some ways I aged overnight. I attempted to remain strong for her and for us, but when she passed, something inside me shattered. The world felt colder and emptier. It was as though a light had extinguished, and I didn't know how to navigate back to the warmth. Dad changed too. At first I believed it was sadness. Losing the person you've lived with can break anyone. He ceased attending work regularly, spent more time at home, and communicated less and less. His embraces became tighter and longer, as if he was clinging to the last fragment of something he couldn't bear to lose. Seemed almost tender at that moment. Even reassuring, I thought we were supporting each other to endure the worst days of our lives. But sadness doesn't always unite people. Sometimes it distorts them, and as the days turned into weeks, I started to observe fractures in the father. I believed I knew. He wasn't only aloof, he was altered. His gaze lingered too long on his touches, felt inappropriate reflecting back. I wish I had heeded the voice in my mind, signaling that something wasn't right. But at 16, mourning alone, it's simpler to silence that voice than confront what it's trying to communicate. So I did. I reassured myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, since everything already felt so off. I desired so much to assume he was merely attempting to shield me, just like I'd always thought he would. Please remember to share, like, and subscribe to this video before we continue. We were seated in the living room, a space that previously felt warm and vibrant, but now seemed like a hollow shell. The TV was on, but I wasn't focusing on it for more content that sheds light on difficult stories and important conversations. It began on a calm evening with just the two of us. The house felt heavier than ever. silent in a way that made you acutely aware of every small sound, like the creak of the couch as you shifted your weight, the low buzz of the refrigerator in the kitchen, and even the slight rustle of leaves outside the window. He continued, "You both look so much like her." I don't think he was either. It was merely background noise, a distraction from the void that loomed above us. I turned to face him when I heard his voice suddenly low and almost soft. People had often said that I had my mom's eyes and smile, but I was bewildered and didn't know how to respond. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. It was such a simple action, one that could have seemed innocent in another situation, but it didn't come across as innocent. His hand lingered for too long, causing my body to tense and a knot to develop in my stomach. I wanted to rise and say something, but I was unable to do so. It was as if my body and mind had disconnected, leaving me motionless. "You're so beautiful," he said. Panic ensued as his hand moved lower, skimming across my breast, and his words lingered in the air, suffocating me before I could grasp what was occurring. His hand was now positioned on my shoulder. It felt unreal to me, enveloped in layers of disbelief that this was indeed my father and that this situation was impossible. I eventually snapped out of my daze when he brushed my thigh. "Dad, what are you doing?" I questioned, my voice shaky as I spoke. The room appeared to spin around me, and my heart raced so loudly that I feared it might burst. He did not reply, but instead placed a finger against his lips as if to hush me and leaned in closer. My body resisted, overwhelmed with the urge to scream and push him away. The seconds that followed seemed to rush past in a blur, as if every muscle had frozen in terror. More than anything, I recall the silence. Not from him as he whispered incomprehensible words, but from me. I didn't scream. I remember him pulling me to the ground, his weight pressing down on me, the stinging pain and the tears streaming down my face. I refrained from fighting back. I merely lay there. When it ended, he got up and began to walk away, leaving frozen tears soaking the carpet beneath me. The most agonizing part wasn't the pain or the betrayal. It was the guilt. A small, sneaky voice in my head, repeatedly whispering that I had done something to provoke this, even though I had no idea what it could be. After that night, I isolated myself in my room for a week, unable to discern how the walls felt. I remained there for what seemed like hours, too shocked to move, my mind racing with unanswerable questions. How had this happened? Why had this transpired? And why hadn't I intervened? That night, I ignored my dad's pleas through the door, skipped meals, and buried myself beneath the blankets, as if hiding could somehow erase the past. Every time I shut my eyes, I was transported back, as though concealment was the only barrier separating me from a now unfamiliar, frightening, and suffocating outside world. Hearing his voice and feeling his weight on the floor left me unsure of how to respond, so I simply let myself become numb. On the 6th day, Valerie knocked on the door and said, "It's him." His voice was gentler than I'd ever known, causing a tightness in my chest. I wanted to scream at him to leave, but I stayed silent, hoping he would think I wasn't there. Yet he continued. "I understand you're upset," he added, "but we need to discuss this." Hearing him say, "We're all we have now," felt like a slap to the face, and my stomach churned. Before I could let my anger take over, doubt began to surface. He'd be correct? I kept questioning myself. What if I was overreacting? What if I had done something to bring this about since my mom was gone and it was truly just the two of us? I finally permitted him in. After he kept twisting the guilt knife more and farther, he perched on the edge of my bed, his face filled with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. Guilt, grief, or something else, and I couldn't avoid him forever. Part of me was nervous for answers, any explanation that would clarify this. "All, I'm sorry if I hurt you," he whispered. I reached for my hand and pulled it back. He used her as a shield, integrating her memory into his words like a weapon. "I shouldn't have done what I did." He stated his expression, darkening briefly before softening once more. "You're so much like your mom," he whispered. "Sometimes I forget. I just miss you. Really remind me of her when I'm by myself. And I'm not sure. Perhaps I misunderstood. Won't occur again." But by the time it did, 2 weeks later, he had started to alter the narrative to depict himself as a victim of loneliness and grief. He ceased knocking and instead entered my room without consent, sitting on the bed and trying to act as though nothing had altered. He would bring up daily topics like school dinner plans and chores, as if to reassure me that we were still a family and that life hadn't been altered. However, every time he gazed at me, I sensed that expectation, as if he was waiting for me to make it right again. The second time was less, but no less painful. It was a Saturday. We had just finished our meal at night. He approached me from behind and placed a hand on my shoulder while I was washing the dishes. "Let's watch a movie," he said. Even though the tone was lighthearted and nearly joyful, something about it caused me to shudder. Despite my wish to refuse and find an excuse to retreat to my room, I couldn't prevent myself from following him into the living room. I told myself that it was fine that he wouldn't try anything and that I could leave if I felt uneasy. But then his hand found my leg, and the cycle began anew. His touches were kinder and less hurried this time, as if he were trying to acclimate me to this new reality. When it was done, he gave me a look that was almost tender and said, "Next time, I'll be more careful." I swear carefully that this was normal, that we merely needed to get accustomed to it. His words kept repeating in my head, twisting my feelings of guilt and shame into something even more sinister. Perhaps I was at fault. Perhaps I had permitted this to occur. Perhaps I owed it to him to offer him something he asserted he needed. But it also made me feel ill and compelled me to remain silent for weeks afterward. I immersed myself in books and schoolwork, anything to occupy my mind, and ceased hanging out with friends, communicating with teachers, and doing anything that might spark inquiries that I didn't know how to address. However, the moments when I couldn't escape the awkward dinners, the quiet evenings, and the times when he would gaze at me for too long were the moments that shattered my heart. I thought about confiding in anyone, my best friend, a counselor, or even a stranger on the street. But the dread always returned the closer I approached. What if I wasn't believed by them? I remained silent because the questions were too many and the answers were too risky. What if they accused me? What if it ruined the little family I had left? Weeks morphed into months, and the incidents with my dad became less surprising, but no less painful. They occurred sporadically, sometimes weeks apart, as if he was testing how far he could go without completely breaking me. I began to rationalize it, reassuring myself that perhaps this was just how grief had shattered him, and maybe it wasn't as severe as it felt after all. He always apologized afterward, his words soaked with guilt and promises to improve. And he swore he loved me, that I was the only reason he continued going. It was distorted, but without anyone else. I started to believe him, even though it didn't lessen the revulsion I felt every time he touched me. As time went on, my urge to scream and flee to resist waned, and was replaced by a numbed acceptance that it was simpler this way, and that resisting would only exacerbate the situation. On a dark level, I held on to the attention, because it wasn't love, but rather a bond, a twisted, dreadful form of comfort that helped to reduce the agony of loneliness. Then Elmas arrived. She was lively, full of spirit, and had the kind of laugh that could brighten a room when my dad presented her as his girlfriend. I felt a peculiar blend of relief and jealousy relief, because I thought perhaps this indicated he would cease, that he would redirect his attention to her and leave me alone. But jealousy infiltrated as well, a sick, shameful emotion I couldn't completely comprehend. Was it jealousy of her, of the notion that she could provide him something I couldn't? Or was it anger that he could fake normalcy with her? While I was suffocating in the chaos he had wrought for a few months, things were still during the nights when he would enter my room, and I started to feel like I could breathe again. I immersed myself in school, attempting to rebuild some version of a life, but that fragile peace shattered one night when I returned home early from a study group. I entered the living room to see Ella sitting too close to me on the couch, her hand on my thigh while my dad watched. "You're so beautiful," she told me, her voice sweet and syrupy. My stomach churned. My dad didn't stop her. If anything, he seemed to support it. That night, the boundaries I believed had been reestablished were completely ruined. Ella joined him in the abuse, her presence making it seem even more surreal. She smiled and whispered reassurances that I didn't want to hear, her touch just as unwelcome as his, making me feel like I was drowning all over again. The betrayal hit harder this time because it was her, not just him. Additionally, and worse, he perceived nothing wrong with it. We are alone. Nobody else can understand that we are family and take care of one another. So one night, I could no longer bear it and confronted him, my voice trembling with rage and desperation, saying, "I don't want to do this," as I wiped a tear from my face. He was briefly surprised as I hurried out with my words before I could lose my composure. "I don't want her here. She's making things worse." "You're jealous," he said, sounding upset, as though I had just accused him of a serious injustice. To my surprise, a week later, L.A. was gone. "You don't want to share me." "I'm not jealous," I replied softly, my voice shaking. "I just want it to stop." He told me in a gentle, almost proud tone that I couldn't bear the thought of making you unhappy. His words were a twisted form of confirmation that, despite everything else falling apart, I still had some control over my life. However, the relief didn't last long because his touches became more frequent and his explanations more intricate. One night, as his hand brushed against my back, he said people wouldn't understand, but that's okay. We don't need anyone else. I wanted to scream at him, telling him that what he was doing was wrong and that I wasn't a substitute for my mother, but the words stayed caught in my throat, weighed down by guilt and fear. With no door and only walls that tightened around me, the more I tried to comprehend it, the less sense it made. Nevertheless, they became part of the background noise of my life, blending into the routine. I stopped questioning it because doing so would require me to confront the full weight of what was happening, and I wasn't sure I could endure that. University was meant to be a new beginning, an opportunity to leave behind all that had transpired and rediscover myself. I had fought hard to remain close to home due to my dad's insistence, but even a small distance felt like liberation. The campus was vibrant with energy, populated by new faces, infinite possibilities, and the promise of a life not constrained by the confines of my house. I immersed myself in my classes, seizing every opportunity to lose myself in textbooks and lectures, which provided me with a distraction from the chaos I had left behind. However, even amidst crowded lecture halls and bustling study groups, the burden of my secret trailed me. I would find myself recoiling at casual touches or dodging friendly smiles out of fear that someone might get too close. Trust felt like a strange concept that I wasn't sure I could ever grasp again. Then I met Samra Gillespie. We were assigned to the same group for a history project, and she embodied everything I lacked. She was funny, confident, and so inherently kind that it almost pained me to be in her presence. She was the kind of girl who illuminated a room effortlessly, so initially, I kept my distance for safety's sake. She could answer questions in class or laugh with friends in the cafeteria with such grace that it appeared the world had no impact on her. Sam would not permit me to do so just by gazing at you, Valerie. She had a gift for attracting people and making them feel valued. One day, she mentioned we were in the same group after class, and her smile set my heart racing. I wanted to grab coffee and brainstorm, but our chat swiftly morphed into hours of discussing the project. She shared stories about her family, her passion for photography, and her aspirations to travel the globe one day. I recounted tales about my mom and how I cherished reading, explaining how university felt like a lifeline. Her narrative was filled with adventures and grand ambitions, whereas mine was meticulously curated to omit the parts that were too painful to voice. We started to spend more time together in the weeks that followed, which I clung to desperately at first. It was unintentional. She invited me to join her for lunch or requested my company at study sessions, which transformed into late-night conversations. But being with her felt different. It was akin to stepping into the sun after years spent in darkness. For the first time, I felt truly seen, and that realization frightened me. Each time I contemplated revealing everything to her, allowing her into the parts of my life I had hidden from others, my chest would tighten. What if she held a different perception of me, or even worse, what if she betrayed my trust? How could I justify the actions I had taken and permitted to occur? So one evening when Sam invited me, I maintained the barriers despite the fact that I could sense them gradually falling apart every time she smiled at me. I went to view a movie at her dorm. It felt significant, yet simple and casual. We chuckled at the absurdity of the film while sitting next to each other on her bed with a bowl of popcorn between us. At one moment, our hands brushed, and I felt tense all over. She clearly noticed, but rather than pulling away, she placed her hand over mine and said, "You're safe." Her words had a deep effect on me. I wished to trust her so that I could relax in the safety she offered, but I couldn't do so because the fear was too loud, overpowering. So I excused myself to the bathroom and gazed at my reflection, tears welling in my eyes. I longed for normalcy, for the chance to hold her hand without feeling overwhelmed by life's burdens. The following morning, I resolved that I couldn't keep living this divided existence, with one part of me still feeling bound by my father's control and the other longing for connection, wanting to be with Samara. They could not coexist. I had to bring it to an end. That evening, when I sat down with my dad for the first significant conversation we'd had in months, my hands were trembling, my throat parched, but I forced the words out. "Dad, it must stop. I am unable to. We are unable to accomplish that." "You don't mean that, Valerie," he replied, his voice low and almost pleading, his face twisted in a mixture of astonishment and what seemed to be betrayal. "You understand that we are all that we have," I replied, my voice rising. "I mean it. I can no longer live like this. This isn't normal, and it's not acceptable." He gave the impression for a moment that he might disagree, before nodding and saying in a quiet voice, "If that's what you want, I'll stop." I wanted to believe him. Although I didn't trust him, my instincts were strong. Days turned into weeks, and even though my dad had promised to stop, his presence still loomed over every aspect of my life like a shadow. Every time he looked at me, talked to me, or even walked by my room, I felt that familiar knot in my stomach, and I wanted to trust him. I really did. But faith felt impossible since his promises had been broken before. So why would this time be any different? Meanwhile, Samara remained my lifeline. Even on the worst days, she had a way of making me feel like I could breathe again. She said in a gentle yet impactful voice, "Do you ever feel as though you're bearing something too weighty to manage on your own?" I paused, my hands clutching the grass blades below me. I longed to share everything with her, but each time I attempted to speak, dread stifled me. What if she had a different view of me? But what if she loathed me even more? What if my dad was imprisoned after she reported it when I finally replied, my voice, which was barely above a murmur? She didn't push. Instead, she just nodded and placed her palm over mine silently, reminding me that she was always there for me that evening. I stayed awake in bed. I couldn't assert that no matter what he had done, I wanted to believe that Samara would comprehend. But how could I articulate something so twisted while I was staring at the ceiling and mentally re-experiencing the exchange entirely different from what she had ever envisioned?